June 4th, 1942. 13,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, northeast of Midway Atoll. The crew aboard the Japanese cruiser Chikuma's reconnaissance float plane had been airborne for hours, scanning an empty ocean. At 7:28 that morning, they'd spotted what every Japanese naval officer had been waiting for: American warships. Not just any warships, carriers. At first, the report was cautious. 10 ships, types undetermined. Then, as they circled closer, the details crystallized. 2 carriers, cruisers, destroyers. The pilot radioed the coordinates back to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force. The Americans had taken the bait, but something didn't add up. Japanese intelligence had been clear. After the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, the Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, sunk, her magazines detonating, her hull ablaze before she went under. The carrier Yorktown had taken severe damage. Bombs had penetrated her flight deck, exploded deep inside her hull, knocked out boilers, caused flooding. Japanese pilots reported her burning, dead in the water. Intelligence estimates said she'd need months of repairs. 3 months at minimum. More likely, she'd been written off as a total loss, too damaged to save. That left the Americans with Enterprise and Hornet, 2 fleet carriers. That's what the operation plan assumed. That's what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's entire strategy for Midway was built around. 2 carriers, not 3. At 10 o'clock that morning, after the first devastating American air attacks had been beaten back with no hits scored on the Japanese carriers, Nagumo's staff questioned a captured American airman fished from the ocean. The prisoner, a member of Yorktown's air group, provided information that made it into the official battle report. 3 carriers were operating northeast of Midway: Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, the ship they'd sunk a month ago. The confusion rippled through the command structure. If the intelligence estimates were wrong about Yorktown, what else might they be wrong about? At 3:30 that afternoon, after 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks and the surviving carrier Hiryu had launched strikes that crippled what appeared to be Yorktown, another scout plane from the cruiser Chikuma radioed a report that deepened the mystery. 4 American carriers, 4 cruisers, 15 destroyers. The numbers didn't match anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. They'd hit 1 American carrier hard that afternoon, bombs and torpedoes, smoke pouring from her flight deck, a severe list developing. She was finished, surely, but 4 carriers meant there were 3 more untouched. Where had the 4th come from? The answer was simpler than anyone aboard the Japanese ships realized. They were seeing Yorktown twice, once as the heavily damaged listing wreck from the afternoon attacks, and again because Yorktown refused to die as the damaged but still afloat carrier their pilots had already claimed destroyed. And they were counting wrong. Enterprise appeared in one position, Hornet in another, the damaged Yorktown somewhere between them. Double counts, confused identifications, the chaos of battle making it impossible to know which ship was which. What the Japanese didn't know was that Yorktown hadn't spent 3 months in a shipyard after Coral Sea. She'd spent 72 hours, 3 days. 1,400 shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had descended on her like ants, working around the clock. They'd patched her flight deck with timber and steel. They'd cut out damaged sections of hull and welded in replacements. They'd done enough, just barely enough, to get her back to sea. Not fully repaired, not ready for extended operations, but ready enough. Admiral Chester Nimitz had given them 3 days to do 3 months of work. Somehow, they'd done it, and now she was here, at Midway, fighting, taking punishment, but fighting. This wasn't supposed to happen. The pattern would repeat itself throughout the war, not just with Yorktown, with other ships, other battles. Each time the same fundamental problem: Japanese damage assessment was catastrophically optimistic. 7 weeks after Midway, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed again near the eastern Solomon Islands. Enterprise took 3 direct bomb hits and 4 near misses that killed 74 men and tore massive holes in her flight deck. Fires raged, her steering jammed. For a time, she couldn't control her own course. Damage control teams worked desperately to patch the flight deck enough to keep operating aircraft. Japanese pilots reported her sinking. The broadcasts went out. The claims went into the official records. Another American carrier destroyed. Enterprise didn't sink. 3 weeks later, she was back at Pearl Harbor. 6 weeks after that, she was back in the South Pacific. Still fighting. On October 26th, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Japanese carrier aircraft finally achieved what had eluded them since the war began, sinking an American fleet carrier in open combat. Hornet took multiple bomb and torpedo hits. Fires consumed her. Her crew abandoned ship. American destroyers tried to scuttle her with torpedoes and gunfire to prevent her capture. She refused to sink. When Japanese destroyers arrived, they finished the job with 4 long-lance torpedoes. Hornet finally went under just after 1:30 in the morning. But Japanese pilots didn't just claim Hornet. They claimed 3 carriers sunk that day, plus a battleship, a cruiser, a destroyer, an unidentified large warship. Enterprise had been damaged again, 2 bomb hits, 2 near misses. But she survived. She was the only American fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific theater. Her crew knew it. They hung a sign near the ship's island that read, "Enterprise versus Japan." It wasn't far from the truth. How did this happen? How did experienced combat pilots, men who'd trained for years, who'd struck Pearl Harbor and ranged across the Pacific in the war's opening months, consistently report sinking ships that refused to die? The answer lay in the nature of carrier warfare itself. When a dive bomber releases its weapon and pulls up, climbing away from anti-aircraft fire, the pilot sees the bomb hit, sees the explosion, sees smoke and fire erupting from the target. Then he's gone, racing back to his own carrier, focused on navigation, on fuel state, on getting home alive. He doesn't see what happens next, doesn't see the damage control parties flooding magazines to prevent explosions, doesn't see engineers bypassing damaged systems to restore power, doesn't see crews cutting away wreckage and patching holes, doesn't see the ship still afloat an hour later, 2 hours later, still steaming, still fighting. He sees the hit, the explosion, the smoke, and in that moment, it looks catastrophic, looks fatal. Why wouldn't it be? He's trained to put his bomb through the enemy's flight deck, to rupture fuel lines, to ignite ammunition stores. When he sees massive explosions and towering columns of smoke, his assessment is understandable. Target destroyed. But American carriers were built to take punishment and survive. Multiple watertight compartments, dedicated damage control parties, training that emphasized saving the ship above almost everything else, the capacity to absorb incredible amounts of damage and keep fighting. And there was no way to verify kills. No satellites, no reconnaissance drones, no ability to return to the battle area hours later and confirm the ship had actually gone down. In the vast Pacific, ships separated by hundreds of miles, a pilot's combat report was the only evidence of what happened. So the claims went up the chain. Carrier sunk, battleship destroyed, cruiser burning and dead in the water. Each report reinforced by others. Multiple pilots reporting hits on the same target. The assessments looking more solid with each confirming statement. And at headquarters, officers wanted to believe the good news, needed to believe it, the alternative, that they were throwing away their best pilots, their best planes, their irreplaceable combat veterans in strikes that accomplished less than everyone thought was too grim to accept. The Americans did the same thing, overclaimed their victories. reported enemy ships sunk that weren't. The human eye, under stress, in combat, seeing explosions and fire and chaos, isn't a precision instrument. Both sides inflated their successes and minimized their failures. But the Japanese system had a specific problem that compounded the issue. Their naval culture placed enormous emphasis on aggressive action, on offensive spirit, on never admitting defeat or failure. Pilots who'd attacked an American carrier and returned to report anything less than its destruction risked looking ineffective, timid, uncommitted to the mission. And there was no mechanism to correct the errors. American carriers operated with other ships. Cruisers and destroyers in the screening force could confirm whether a carrier had actually sunk, could report back that the carrier had survived, was retiring from the battle area, was still operational. Japanese intelligence analysts could cross-reference pilot reports with radio intercepts, with submarine sightings, with reconnaissance data. But once a ship was claimed, sunk in the heat of battle, the claim tended to stick. It went into the records. It shaped the next operation's planning assumptions. It became accepted fact until that dead ship showed up in the next battle. At Midway, the confusion about carrier numbers, 2, 3, or 4 American carriers present, stemmed directly from these assessment failures. Yorktown, reported as sunk or too damaged to operate after Coral Sea, appeared in fighting condition. Then, after taking severe damage from Hiryu's afternoon strikes, she appeared in reconnaissance reports alongside undamaged carriers, creating the phantom 4th carrier that never existed. The intelligence failures compounded. Before Midway, Japanese planners assumed the Americans could muster at most 2 carriers. They based their entire strategy on that assumption. Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force, 4 fleet carriers, the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled, seemed overwhelmingly superior to anything the Americans could field. Then, 3 American carriers showed up. Then reports suggested 4. The advantage Nagumo thought he had evaporated. Suddenly, the Americans had parity, maybe superiority. The psychological impact rippled through the decision-making on Nagumo's flagship. The assumptions underlying the entire operation were wrong. What else might be wrong? Enterprise's ghost-like ability to survive attack after attack earned her the nickname among Japanese forces that American sailors later adopted with pride: the Gray Ghost. 3 times during the war, Japan announced her destruction. 3 times she returned. After the war, when American investigators interviewed Japanese naval officers about their damage assessment methods, the responses were illuminating. Rear Admiral Sumikawa, questioned about the accuracy of fighter pilot claims in defensive operations over Rabaul, was blunt. The claims of his pilots, he said, as well as ours, are absurd and not worth considering. It was an acknowledgement of what combat veterans on both sides had long understood. The claims made in the heat of battle bore only passing resemblance to reality. A pilot who claimed 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement might have actually downed 1 or 2. A bombing run reported as obliterating a target might have scored near misses that caused minor damage. A carrier reported as sinking might be back in action weeks later. The problem extended beyond carriers. At the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Japanese forces reported sinking multiple American battleships and cruisers. They claimed decisive victory, the destruction of the American naval presence in the southern Solomons. In reality, American forces had lost ships, cruisers, and destroyers, but not the battleship force. The Americans held Henderson Field. The Japanese troop convoy, the entire purpose of the operation, was forced to turn back. But the reports painted a different picture. Reports of American ships sinking, burning, exploding. Reports of overwhelming Japanese success. By the time accurate intelligence filtered back through the layers of command, the battle was over. The decisions had been made. The next operation was already being planned based on faulty assumptions. The cycle repeated at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese pilots reported sinking multiple American carriers. In one of the most lopsided carrier battles in naval history, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American aviators, Japan lost 3 carriers and the bulk of her remaining trained naval air groups while inflicting relatively minor damage on American forces. Yet Japanese pilots reported devastating American losses. Carriers sunk, carriers burning, massive explosions. The reports bore no relationship to reality. Of the 15 American carriers present, none were sunk. Several took minor damage. The American fleet remained fully operational. The Japanese mobile fleet, by contrast, was shattered. 3 carriers gone to the bottom. Most critically, the trained air crew, the irreplaceable combat veterans who'd survived Midway, survived Guadalcanal, survived the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, were dead, lost attacking a fleet that shot them down in droves, lost in aircraft that plunged into the ocean and never came up, lost to fuel exhaustion when they couldn't find their carriers in the dark. The damage reports didn't reflect the magnitude of the disaster, couldn't reflect it, because the pilots who could have provided accurate assessments were dead. This is the hidden story of the Pacific Carrier War. Not just the famous battles, the dramatic turning points, the individual acts of heroism and sacrifice, but the intelligence failures, the systematic overestimation of success, the ships that refused to die appearing again and again in battles where, according to the official records, they shouldn't have existed. For American forces, the phenomenon created a peculiar kind of psychological warfare. Each time a carrier the Japanese claimed to have sunk appeared in the next battle, it suggested American industrial power was even greater than it actually was. If the Americans could replace fleet carriers that quickly, if they could repair catastrophic damage and return ships to combat in weeks rather than months, what chance did Japan have? In reality, American industrial capacity was enormous. New Essex-class carriers were sliding down the ways regularly by late 1942 and through 1943. The replacement rate was extraordinary. But many of the carriers appearing in battle weren't new construction. They were damaged veterans, ships that should have been under repair for months, rushed back into service because the Navy needed every flight deck available. Enterprise, Saratoga, Yorktown before her loss at Midway. These ships served as the backbone of American carrier operations in the dark, early months when new construction hadn't yet reached the fleet. They took damage that would have sunk lesser vessels. Damage that should have ended their war, and they kept fighting because American damage control doctrine, American shipbuilding practices, and American shipyard efficiency made what seemed impossible routine. For the Japanese, the intelligence failures had strategic consequences. Planning for each operation, commanders based their force allocations on assessments of enemy strength that were fundamentally wrong. If 3 American carriers had been sunk in recent battles, only 2 or 3 should be available for the next engagement. But then 4 or 5 appeared. The calculation of forces, the risk assessment, the entire strategic picture was distorted. After Midway, the Japanese believed they'd sunk 2 American carriers, Yorktown and 1 other. Nagumo's battle report explicitly claimed 2 carriers destroyed. This claim may have contributed to his not being relieved of command, despite the catastrophic loss of all 4 Japanese carriers. He'd reported inflicting significant damage on the enemy. 2 carriers sunk partially offset the loss of 4. It looked less like an unmitigated disaster and more like a costly but not one-sided engagement. In reality, only Yorktown was lost. Enterprise and Hornet survived without significant damage. The pattern continued through the Santa Cruz Islands, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea. Each time claimed sinkings that didn't match reality. Each time the ghost ships appearing in the next battle. But beyond the specific instances, beyond the individual battles where American carriers refused to die, there's a broader truth about the nature of naval warfare in the Pacific. Combat at sea, particularly carrier combat fought over the horizon with aircraft, is fundamentally chaotic. Information is partial, confused, often wrong. Decisions get made on incomplete data. Ships appear and disappear into weather fronts. Distances collapse perception into unreliability. The Japanese weren't uniquely prone to overclaiming. The Americans did it too. British and German naval forces in the Atlantic overclaimed. It's inherent to combat. What made the Pacific Carrier War distinctive was the scale, the distances, the difficulty of verification, and the strategic consequences when the assessments proved wrong. When a pilot reported sinking Enterprise in August 1942, and Enterprise appeared at Santa Cruz 2 months later, still fighting, it wasn't deception or incompetence. It was the fog of war. The pilot had seen what looked like catastrophic damage, had reported honestly what he observed. The assessment that the ship was lost followed logically from the observation. But observation isn't reality. The bomb hit doesn't tell you whether the ship survived. The explosion doesn't reveal whether damage control parties successfully contained the flooding. The smoke doesn't indicate whether the fires were extinguished before reaching the magazines, and so the ghost ships kept appearing. Yorktown at Midway, when she should have been in Puget Sound for months of repairs. Enterprise after the Eastern Solomons, after Santa Cruz, after multiple attacks that should have ended her war. Saratoga, torpedoed multiple times, disappearing for repairs, then returning months later when Japanese intelligence had written her off as a total loss. Each appearance forced a recalculation, forced planners to acknowledge that their understanding of American carrier strength was wrong, forced tactical commanders to confront the reality that the enemy they faced was stronger than the intelligence estimates suggested. The culmination came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japan committed virtually every operational naval unit to one massive, desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet. The planning assumed the American carrier forces had been significantly weakened by earlier battles. The assessment proved spectacularly wrong. American carriers appeared in overwhelming numbers. The Japanese surface fleet was annihilated. After Leyte Gulf, Japan's capacity for naval operations effectively ended. The few remaining carriers had no aircraft, no trained pilots to fly them. The battleships and cruisers that survived had no fuel to sortie. The war at sea was over, but even in defeat, in the final months, the overclaiming continued. Kamikaze pilots reported carriers sunk. Submarines reported battleships destroyed. The claims bore less and less relationship to reality as American forces approached the home islands. By then, it didn't matter. The ghost ships that refused to die, the carriers that kept appearing in battle after battle despite being claimed destroyed, had done their work. They'd bought time. Time for American industry to build the fleet that would win the war. Time for American training programs to produce the pilots and sailors who would man that fleet. Time for the enormous industrial and human resources of the United States to be mobilized and brought to bear. Yorktown's 3-day resurrection at Pearl Harbor, her appearance at Midway when Japanese intelligence said she couldn't be there, may have been the most consequential 72 hours of work in the Pacific War. Not just because Yorktown's air group helped sink 3 Japanese carriers, but because her presence suggested something that terrified Japanese planners. The Americans could do the impossible, could repair the irreparable, could make shattered carriers battle-ready in days instead of months. Whether it was true in every case didn't matter. The perception shaped strategic thinking, shaped how Japanese commanders assessed their chances, shaped how they allocated resources, how they calculated odds, how they made decisions. And every time a carrier they'd claimed destroyed showed up in the next battle, the perception was reinforced. The Americans had an inexhaustible supply of carriers. Damage didn't stop them, losses didn't slow them, the ships just kept coming. In the end, the ghost ships weren't really ghosts. They were symbols of 2 different approaches to naval aviation, to damage control, to shipbuilding, to training. The American system, for all its flaws and mistakes and early disasters, had built-in resilience, the capacity to take punishment and keep fighting, the ability to repair ships faster than enemies expected, the industrial base to replace losses and expand the fleet simultaneously. The Japanese system, despite its early successes and the extraordinary skill of its pre-war naval aviators, was brittle. When the carefully trained and nurtured carrier air groups were destroyed at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea, they couldn't be replaced. When carriers were sunk, new ones couldn't be built fast enough. When damage was inflicted, repairs took longer than the strategic situation allowed. And all along, the intelligence picture stayed distorted. The claims of enemy ships sunk accumulated in the records while those same ships appeared in the next battle. The ghost ships that refused to die. Yorktown lasted until June 7, 1942. Not at Coral Sea, where the Japanese thought they'd finished her, but at Midway, where after taking bomb and torpedo damage that would have destroyed most ships, she finally succumbed to submarine-launched torpedoes while under tow. She went down fighting, taking punishment until the very end, her survival long past, when she should have sunk a testament to American damage control and shipbuilding. Enterprise survived the entire war, 20 battle stars, more major actions than any other American warship. Hit repeatedly, damaged badly, claimed sunk 3 times by Japanese forces. She kept coming back. The ghost ship that wouldn't die became the symbol of American resilience in the Pacific. The Japanese admirals who'd planned operations assuming these ships were gone, who'd based strategies on intelligence estimates that proved catastrophically wrong, learned the lesson too late. By the time they understood the magnitude of American industrial capacity, the resilience of American damage control, the speed of American repairs, the war was already lost. And somewhere in the official records, filed away in reports from Coral Sea and the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz and the Philippine Sea, are the claims. Carriers sunk, carriers destroyed, carriers that should never have appeared in another battle. Claims that the ships themselves proved wrong, appearing again and again and again, until there were no more battles